So what I want to do today is I want to talk about some trends going on in the world that are impacting IT and the challenges that they're presenting and some strategies for dealing with them. And we live in a time where a variety of industries are undergoing disruption. So newspapers, the music industry, the television industry are all being disrupted. And actually, it's starting to happen to IT as well. And there are three villains. The first one is cloud computing. And as we'll see, cloud computing really is the primary villain that enables the others. The second one is what's referred to as consumerization of IT. And the third one is changes in the nature of the workplace. And what they're all leading to is that IT is no longer a scarce commodity, either when it comes to cost or availability or knowledge. It's being dispersed. So cloud computing. Cloud computing is great because it creates the possibility for better, faster, cheaper, and easier, which is the holy grail. And in a lot of ways, it has the potential to actually realize that. A couple of problems. The one is that it creates an expectation for that. Well, you should be able to tip this stuff up in the cloud and save 30%. Why can't you do that? Well, it's generally a little more complicated than that. And what the cloud does for IT is it trades agility and flexibility for complexity. So on the one hand, you can say, well, we can spin up servers on demand and we only pay for what we need. But at the same time, what you're doing in exchange is you may have to manage an entire graph of cloud providers in order to understand what's going and what happens when there's a problem. If you run your stuff on Heroku and Heroku runs their stuff on Amazon, if Amazon has a problem, you care. But you might not even see that. So it's much more complicated. And then even managing cost becomes more interesting. Instead of saying, well, we have a data center with a bunch of gear in it and it costs us $1 million a year or whatever the case may be, your cost may change by the month, by the day, by the hour. So it's much harder to track. And in addition, cloud computing requires retooling of what you do and how you do it on multiple levels. So people talk about architecting for the cloud, which is shorthand for completely changing the way you think about building applications and systems. So people will say, well, you can't just forklift your stuff to the cloud, you have to re-architect it. Well, that's great, and where you end up may be great, but that is a hard, time-consuming, error-prone, and expensive process. The management tools that you use to manage things may be different. They may need to be retooled. And your staff and your approaches may also need to be retooled. There's stuff that you used to do in IT that you don't necessarily do anymore, and there's new stuff that you didn't do before that now you have to. So cloud computing by itself just kind of, it disrupts how you think about IT. Yes, sir? From an audit perspective, data security is also a problem. If you look at the SLAs, with most of the major cloud computing providers, they don't actually take responsibility for your data and everything. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you look at the contracts, you'll find that they don't put as much due diligence and strong controls around protection of the data compared to, say, what's done in-house. Right, and that's a perfect example about how you trade flexibility for complexity, that answering that question of what is our SLA, what is our security becomes harder. So the second piece of the puzzle is what people have started to talk about in terms of consumerization of IT. Well, what does that mean? Well, the first thing is people are talking about BYOD, bring your own device. It used to be that a cell phone was something that a business person might have. And then a cell phone became something that entire families had. And now a cell phone is a Unix box with a bunch of apps and a really nice browser in your pocket. And everybody carries them around, and everybody expects to be able to use them all the time. And as a result, our personal and our social and our work activities start to blur together. So I have Twitter on here, and I have my business email on here, and I may have access to business apps on here. And it's kind of all in one world, and I start to think about it all in the same way. And so people are starting to expect to have access to everything all the time, any place. You know, there's the joke about, you know, well, do you tweet while you're on the toilet? Well, the idea that you could access the internet and have this really cool application in the bathroom is a very new idea. But that's kind of where we've come. And the second part of consumerization of IT is consumer cloud services. So my son goes to a school where everyone is required to have a laptop. So he brings his laptop home and he starts working on his first paper. And I poke my head in and I say, well, is it set up to back up? How do you back your stuff up? And he said, well, there is no backup. Okay. So 15 minutes later, we have Mosey running on his machine, and now his stuff gets backed up to the cloud every day. So two things have happened there. The first one is that we've gone completely behind the back of the school's IT department that's supposed to be managing his machine. And secondly, we've made things better than they did. And lest you think that we could do this because I'm an IT guy and I'm an expert, when my parents called me up and said, we need to back up our data, what do? I said, go get Mosey. And that's all I did. I didn't give them any help. 3 months later, when their PC blew itself to smithereens and they had to buy a new one and get all their data back, they were able to get their data back without any help from me. So the point is that people are beginning to be able to take over traditional IT functions like backup and email and document management on their own. And the reason that it's happening is not because the enterprise says, let's do this thing that's good. It's because the people who work there are saying, hey, man, I got this thing in my pocket, and I bought it, and I have my family plan, and why should I have to have another one? And how come I can't get all my stuff everywhere? The third piece of the disruption that's happening to IT is that the nature of the workplace itself is changing. And the first thing that's happening is that the relationship between the employer and the employee is starting to change. And if you look at things that people kind of took for granted for 40 or 50 years, like pensions and health insurance, that's starting to shift. And I'm not trying to make any kind of political statement here, but the fact is that the notion of what do I as an employee expect my employer to give me is starting to change. Next, we see people, this whole idea of working from home, which is starting to become accepted. And working from home becomes working from the coffee shop, which becomes co-working. And some companies are starting to formally adopt co-working policies, that it's more flexible and it saves fuel and it increases productivity, what have you. The point is it's starting to become a concept that you could work for a company and not necessarily go to their physical workplace. And one of the key aspects of that from an IT perspective is that the company doesn't supply the phone or the PC or the network anymore. It's supplied by somebody else. If I'm working at home, it's supplied by me. If I'm in the coffee shop, it comes from Starbucks. If I'm at Coco, it's supplied by Coco. But it's not supplied by Best Buy or General Mills or whoever the case may be. And finally, we're seeing a trend of outsourcing, of employees becoming freelancers. Of companies starting to have on-demand relationships with the people who work for them, just like they have on-demand relationships with cloud computing. So the bottom line there is the question of internal. Well, what does that mean anymore? What is an internal resource, whether it be a person or a computing device? So what this all amounts to is that the notion of internal IT and the notion of cloud are starting to merge, and differences between them are starting to dissolve. You can imagine a scenario where Yammer uses ADP as their payroll provider, and ADP uses Yammer as their internal collaboration provider. So who's working for whom, and what's internal and what's external? The next thing is that partly because of this, partly because of things like Mosey and all of the cloud services that are available, internal users become customers, and they expect to be treated like customers. And the defining characteristic there is they have choice, and they have knowledge, and they have power. I don't have a backup, I'll get my own. I need a device, I'll get my own. I want an Android, you do iPhones, well, I want an Android, and I went out and bought one. The whole discussion of shadow IT is proof that this is happening, that people are going out and provisioning their own IT services without the IT department. And critically, more and more users/customers don't differentiate between external and external applications anymore. They want service. They want to be able to do computing. So the role of IT shifts from one of control to one of enablement. And it really becomes a software service provider like any other. And in particular, the PMO starts to look like the marketing group. So the difference between PMO and marketing starts to go away. I'll talk a lot about marketing towards the end of my presentation, and I'm not really differentiating between whether you're a public vendor or a private internal vendor. By complete serendipity, I happened to stumble on a link from my Twitter feed about an hour ago, which was perfect, so I'm just going to read it. It's from a guy named David Knight, who's an interaction designer living in San Francisco, and he says, enterprise and consumer experiences are blurring more every day as applications move to the cloud and companies build a vertical stack of offerings. Today's Facebook and Twitter generation expect their applications to be as easy and enjoyable to use as consumer applications. As the cloud evolves, our design process must evolve with it. Thank you. Presentation done. So if everything is cloud, well, what is cloud? And fundamentally, it's about the union of functionality and operability. All right, what does that mean? Well, I find it instructive to go back and think about the very first software as a service providers and how they pitched themselves. And they said things like, we run it so you don't have to. We ensure availability and security and data integrity, and we have redundant data centers and offsite backup and so on and so forth. And then the other interesting thing that they said is, well, when we update things, you automatically get the updates. You don't have to worry about version compatibility or patches or anything like that. Now, this was not the ops guys talking. This was the marketing group talking. And what they were pitching was ops stuff. And what they were saying, and what cloud and software as a service is about, is that ops is actually part of the product. It's part of what you're selling. It's part of your value proposition. And continuous improvement in the product is part of the service that you're providing. And what happens as a result is that the cloud gives customers an appetite for near constant change. And what we're doing is we're reducing the cost of change for the customer to almost zero. So if you think back to the older software days when software was delivered, here's a new version of the software. It requires beefier hardware. It uses more network resources. You need more disk storage. Oh, by the way, you have to upgrade the operating system. So the cost to the customer of changing to get your new functionality was relatively high. With software as a service, it's almost non-existent. There is still a cost. It's largely a non-technical cost, and I'll talk about that later. But this doesn't necessarily reduce your cost as a vendor. Again, whether you're internal IT or not, doesn't matter. So enter lean. And put very simply, lean is about efficiently providing value in a world where change and uncertainty is the norm. So the customer is saying, more change, faster, faster. And you as a vendor have to say, well, how the heck do I do that? So lean tries to answer that. So firstly, it's about the notion of pulling from the customer rather than pushing to the customer. And that doesn't mean that you just do whatever the customer tells you whenever, but it means that you need to continuously attune yourself to, well, what is the change that the customer wants today as opposed to the one they wanted yesterday? What is the change that they don't want today that you thought they wanted yesterday? It means that you focus on maximizing value flow. So if there's value, if there's functionality, if there's service that the customer wants, how do you get it to them as quickly and efficiently as possible with maximum quality and minimum waste? How do you get things out of the way of delivering change well? You do what's called minimizing non-value added activities. So if there's stuff that you just don't need to do, don't do it. The example of that in the cloud is if you're running on a cloud provider, you don't need to run Cat5 cable anymore. Running Cat5 cable doesn't provide any value to your customer. Now, for Amazon, it's of huge value because you're their customer and they're running Cat5 cable for you. So it's of tremendous value to them. So what you've done is you've moved that work to the place where it's synced with providing value instead of where it's out of sync. The greatest value is giving your customer what they want, when and how they want it. And the greatest waste is giving them something they don't want or they don't need. Not only does it make them unhappy, but you've burned a lot of resource to get there, and now you have to undo all that resource to do something different instead. Okay. So before I talk about DevOps, I want to very briefly mention Agile, because people hear about Agile and they hear about Lean. Well, Agile is a Lean practice or a Lean approach. If you take the basic premise of we value working code over documentation. What that's saying is the most important thing is to get the customer something they want that works. And other things are supportive to that to the extent that we need them. It tries to get user feedback early and often. Again, attuning itself to the customer. An important notion here is shrinking cycle times. Whether it's in manufacturing or development or operations, when you do big changes, the process of managing them is very complex and it's very easy to get off track and to introduce waste simply in the process of having something big. So Agile, the iterative approach, the story-based approach is about, okay, let's make our changes small so we can run them through to completion efficiently. And really the whole process is organized around collaboration and attuning yourself to users. If you look at sort of all of what Agile is about as a philosophy, it's focused on that. And the ultimate kind of holy grail of continuous delivery, where you have the ability to release updates weekly, daily, hourly, is basically about removing friction. I actually like to call it frictionless delivery rather than continuous delivery. The notion that you can deliver working functionality to users as fast as the business wants you to and as fast as the customer wants you to is the holy grail. What's that? I will speak to that. That actually is the non-zero cost of change for the customer. And it's something that is often left out in discussions of continuous delivery as a purely technical activity. But you're absolutely right. So we've introduced this notion that software as a service and cloud is about functionality and operability together, that they are both part of one thing that you're delivering. What that means is if you're going to be lean, your leanness has to cross the blood-brain barrier between development and operations. And the first piece is that inter-organization handoffs introduce waste. One of the things that we saw actually starting way back in the late 80s was people figuring out that having a big development organization and a big QA organization with these over-the-wall handoffs didn't work very well. It was very inefficient. It was bad for morale. It didn't necessarily increase quality. So companies started to blow it up and take QA people and embed them into the development organizations. And at least what I saw participating in this in the 80s and 90s was that quality skyrocketed almost immediately. So DevOps is about, among other things, doing the same thing between development and operations. Those of us who do development, those of us who are in IT have seen innumerable times how painful it is for both sides to do handoffs between development and operations. By itself, ops needs to be more agile. So if the customer isn't going to have to worry about upgrading the operating system for the new release, well, then the service provider has to, which means the ops group needs to be able to move quickly in order to not introduce friction into the delivery of value to the customer. Cloud elasticity is basically the IT ops version of just-in-time or pull, so that you only configure resources, you only tip up servers when your customers need them. Netflix is kind of the poster child for the scalable cloud architecture. And they will scale up and down by thousands of servers in a matter of hours. So they are provisioning resources literally just in time, so that when everybody comes home from work and turns on Netflix or sits down on a Friday night, their server count goes zzz, and then when people start going to bed or whatever the heck they do, it starts to scale down. So DevOps is characterized, first of all, by leanness, as we mentioned, short cycle times, minimizing non-value add activities. When you look at things that are going on in ops automation, that's really what that's about. Why are we manually configuring Apache on 10 servers? What is the value there? What if we can do it automatically and script it so that whenever a server comes up, it gets auto-provisioned? And continuous improvement. There's been a lot of chatter on Twitter and some of the blogs about DevOps versus NoOps and what that means. And from a certain perspective, it really means nothing. Because all it's about is operations providing more and more value and more automation to development groups. Similarly to the way that development and QA come together, development and QA and operations come together from a collaboration perspective. So you have a very agile situation where you have stand-ups, and if you have Kanban boards, everybody's participating in the Kanban boards. You have integrated teams. So the approaches and the techniques that we're getting used to in the Agile world, in a DevOps world, they simply expand to include operations. And what to me is the most important piece of DevOps is unity of purpose. And this comes back, and in some sense, this is all I'm really talking about today, and I'm going to repeat it over and over again. That in a software service world, the feature set and the operations of the service are one thing, and that's what you're selling, and that's what your customer is buying. So development and QA need to care about the operability of the service, and operations needs to care about the functionality of the service. So they're all working towards the same purpose. So that's great. That's DevOps. Now you know everything you need to know about DevOps. My thesis is that it is necessary but not sufficient. So let's go back to the key characteristic of cloud services. It's the word service. Okay, so what is a service? Well, it's an experience with multiple touch points occurring over time. So if I go to get my car serviced, I start by making an appointment. I show up. I get met. Guy walks around the car and says, we're going to charge you $400. I sign the piece of paper. I go sit in the waiting room for a couple of hours. I get my car. I pay my bill. I go home. Maybe I get a survey. So I've had an experience with a bunch of different people and a bunch of different processes that have happened over time. Some of them are invisible, the actual act of servicing the car. Some of them involve human interaction. Some of them are online. The sum total of that is my experience of getting my car serviced. So it's an end-to-end customer journey, and it may actually span provider boundaries. If I tip up a Tumblr blog and I want to turn commenting on my blog, I use Discuss. So I now have two providers to deal with, and two providers to understand, and two providers to provision. So kind of what this is about is starting to shift our view from things and applications and pieces to the end-to-end experience from the customer's perspective. And as someone said, that what we need to do is design digital services, not websites. Again, from a lean perspective, if we're going to be lean, if we're going to maximize flow, if we're going to minimize waste, if we're going to attune ourselves as well as we can with delivering value to our customer, we need to align everyone who serves that customer journey with each other and with the customer. So that goes beyond development, it goes beyond operations, and it starts to involve marketing and design and support. So if we're going to think about services, we need to think about designing services, and this is where the methodology or the discipline of service design comes in. And what service design does is it takes traditional product design approaches and applies them to services. So it looks at them from a human-centered perspective. It applies design thinking. It tries to go beyond pure utility and think about usability and satisfaction. But where that used to be applied to a piece of graphic design or a web page or a chair, now it's applied to a service experience. So people are designing things like the process of going to the doctor in the same way that they might design a chair or a website. And an important piece is that it's concerned with both the visible and invisible components. So if your process of moving patients from the nurse to the doctor and back again, or getting the car into the service bay and out is very inefficient, then either your service will be very expensive or your customer won't be satisfied. Well, I think it depends. I mean, it's something you have to manage as part of designing the service. It's probably part of the back-end invisible process. Really, what I'm talking about here is a sort of conceptual framework for thinking about how to relate with your customer. And some of the techniques that get used, there's what's known as a customer journey map. And this is basically a way of charting out how does a customer interact with your service. I was talking with someone, if you look at the cloud infrastructure landscape at this point, particularly a couple of years ago, you would see these services advertised well. Use our service to tip stuff up on Amazon or whatever, and it's really transparent and really easy, and that's all great. The problem is, how do you get onboarded? And very few of them had addressed onboarding. Well, if I can't onboard my stuff, if I can't migrate my gear or my applications from my data center to your cloud, well, it doesn't do me any good. So onboarding is one of the important pieces of the journey, and it's one that often gets forgotten. Customer journey maps are really helpful in terms of identifying gaps. What is it that the customer is trying to do that we just haven't thought about? And identifying ways that you can provide more value. Here's something that we could do. Maybe we're Tumblr and we've just tipped up our blog, and then we look at it and say, oh, well, people want to allow comments. So how could we do that? The next piece is the service blueprint. And what the service blueprint does is it connects the customer journey to how you're actually going to do it. How are we going to satisfy this stuff? And some of it may just be human. They're going to call us up and we're going to talk to them on the phone. Some of it may be digital. But you have to account for all of it. And then there's what's known as an expectation map. And the expectation map looks at what is important, what is most important, and what is it that makes the users happy and unhappy. And this may feel very kind of fluffy and touchy-feely, but it actually speaks directly to the operations world. So we know that if your website stays up during the hurricane, people are happy. And we know that if you have an outage or a security breach, people are pissed off. It's funny because in the operations world, we actually deal with people's emotional expectations a lot. We often feel like people are pissed off at us because we're not going fast enough. That's a very emotional thing. And when we're designing a service, we need to think about that and think about how to solve for it. A key point is the purpose of these is to provide a focus to think about what is this service that we're delivering and what are all of the pieces that we have to solve. It's not to be a bunch of artifacts that you spend a bunch of money drawing pretty pictures and then you put them up on the wall. So user-centered IT. So what we really have is we have functionality. What are the features? We have operability. Does the thing stay up? Does it scale? Does it maintain data consistency? Is it secure? And what is the service experience? It's driven by the customer journey. It's organized by the service blueprint. And it addresses off-site as well as on-site parts of the solution. Email, phone, chat, Twitter. What does your call center have to look like? It's often the case where people sit down and they have a great idea for a service and they design it and then go, oh, well, people are going to have to call us up on the phone to ask for help. Well, what does that look like? And how do we operate it? And how do we give the call center people access to the information that they need so that they can answer people's questions? That's all part of the service. Interestingly, for Netflix, at least so far, the post office is actually one of the touch points that their customers have with them. And they still have those little envelopes, and they've worked very hard to make those envelopes really easy to use, because they understand that that's part of the service they're providing. So user-centered IT is really about integrating lean IT and design thinking. So, okay, what does that actually look like? Well, just like DevOps, it's leanness, collaboration, and unity of purpose. So leanness, it means that everybody from marketing and design all the way through operations and support is focused on a working service over the delivery of artifacts. One thing that I want to stop and stress, and this comes straight from the Agile Manifesto, is when people say things like, we value A over B, we value working code over documentation, it doesn't mean that you don't ever do B. It means that you evaluate B from the perspective of, does it help us, and how does it help us get where we really want to know? There's been some discussion lately. People are starting to talk about lean UX and things like, we value working websites over wireframes. And people are getting sort of spun up saying, well, wait a minute, you mean we don't do wireframes anymore? Well, wireframes are important. Well, if they are important, then do them. But do them in the context of getting the results to your customer, not because the wireframe is the deliverable itself. Everyone is focused on removing waste, particularly in the area of over-the-wall handoffs. So great, we have this Agile organization that's wonderful, and the dev guys and the QA guys all have lunch together, and they stand-ups together, and now we bring the ops guys in, so everybody's having a good time, and everyone hates marketing, and marketing hates everyone else. It's the same problem, just moved back. So we have to take the same approach. Or, you know, the ops guys and the design guys hate each other, whatever the case may be. There's friction and there's resentment. And so what Lean and Agile and DevOps and user-centered IT are all about is removing that. And we just need to expand that out so that it includes everybody who's involved in delivering this thing we're trying to deliver. Everyone's focused on short cycle times. You know, so whether it's marketing message or UX design or server configuration, we want to get stuff to users in small batches quickly. And everyone is focused on continual improvement. And again, when I say everyone, you know, I'm starting from marketing and I'm going all the way back to the support organization. And if there are other pieces that need to come into play, they need to be included as well. So collaboration. So just more of the same. That, you know, God forbid, your marketing and design and operations people should be in a stand-up together. God forbid that they should use similar tools. Behavior-driven development is a tool that's come out that is a very lightweight, powerful way for sharing understanding of requirements that is starting to get used between BAs and development and QA people. And folks in the ops world are starting to use it. And it makes perfect sense to spread across. So you can imagine a requirement that says, given that user records contain social security numbers, when a production database is stored off-site, then the social security numbers need to be encrypted or redacted or whatever the case may be. That's something that a marketing person and a business person and an ops person can all look at and understand together, and a QA person can test. If you're using something like Kanban, it means that all your tasks have to be on the Kanban board. And to your point, whether you're doing continuous delivery or not, you're focused on delivering functionality to users as quickly and often as you can. And there is a cost to that. There is a training and understanding cost. So there's some marketing activity and some design activity that needs to happen. If you go to Google, if you go to Gmail these days, you'll log in and you'll see these things, or there was something up recently along the lines of, if you want to try out our great new interface, click here. And if you don't like our great new interface and you want to go back to the old one, click here. That was an integrated user training exercise. That was continuous delivery taken beyond the technical perspective. It required involvement from the marketing people, and it required involvement from the design people. And the words I have down at the bottom here, done means working for users and supportable by the business. So done means that if you're doing continuous delivery, it means that all the material necessary in order to reduce the cost of that for the user, to make it as easy as possible for them to absorb that change, has to be dealt with as part of your process. So if you're doing a Kanban board, and your Kanban board is showing you things like, this is the capacity that my testers have to test this stuff, it also needs to show things like, this is the capacity that the marketing people have to write the copy, and the design people have to do the UX for this great new feature that I'm going to tip up 4 hours from now. Unity of purpose. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, and one of the things that's happening in general is people are in the Agile world are trying to figure out the work cycle dissonance between design and development, and that's part of where lean UX is coming from, and I don't think anyone's particularly figured it out yet. The basic notion is to do design in smaller batches, and so my flip answer to you would be the challenge is to do that positioning in smaller batches. But again, the question is, what is done? Is it done because the code is out? Well, no. If your users can't use it or understand it, then you're not done. So you need to, these are the things that we need to start working our way through. So from a unity of purpose perspective, this means, for example, marketing cares about operability. If you're going to put stuff up on your website that says, our service will never go down, and we will never lose any data, and we will never have a security breach, then you care about, to some degree at least, how that is going to happen and whether it's feasible and how badly you're lying. It means that functionality release is a first-class citizen of what you're doing. And it's interesting because in some sense the software as a service world flips things on their head. What you're really in the business of is operating a service. And as part of operating that service, you're continually changing it. So functionality release is actually part of ops. It's part of running the thing. And it's something that customer relations and UX need to care about. We talked about that a minute ago. And as I said, this is the primary place where the cost of change for the customer is still non-zero. They want it, but they have a challenge to absorb it. And that's one of the problems we have to solve for. Outages and security breaches are brand moments, whether you like it or not, and they happen. From everything I've heard, Zappos had a security breach recently where they had a bunch of passwords compromised. And from everything I heard, they responded to it really well, and they ended up enhancing their brand rather than eroding their brand because they took a totally Zappos approach to it. They communicated really clearly. They had their messaging. They had their design all integrated in their communications. They took a completely customer service approach. So they treated a security breach as just another part of being in the service business and just another opportunity to do marketing and design and customer communication. There's a lot of talk in the cloud IT world about what's called design for fail. The notion that you are dependent on these pieces that you don't control, and any of them could fail, and you need to be able to recover from that. Well, design for fail applies to design also. Let's say your website mashes up Google Maps, and Google Maps goes down. Well, what do you do? Do you just have a big blank spot on your page, or do you have something in your UX and something in your application design that allows you to gracefully handle that. The point I'm trying to make here is that thinking about operations is something that the marketing and the design folks need to do. And to your point and your question about cycle times, in this world, marketing and design are something that you're always doing. It's an integral part of the service. You're always measuring or mismeasuring, as the case may be. You're always selling. You're always educating. So whether you do it in an agile, lean, iterative way, it's happening in an agile, lean, iterative way. Every time, if you're delivering new functionality every 2 weeks, you have to sell that functionality every 2 weeks. Because remember, your users are your customers, and they have choice now about whether they want it or not. From a development and QA perspective, hello. The developers need to think about the operations implications of what they're building. I'm going to mention Netflix one more time because they seem to be the poster child for all of this. They make decisions deep in the bowels of their API architecture about how to handle failure cases in API calls based on the impact on the customer experience. And API calls that are part of more critical parts of their service will be handled differently from API calls that are not as central to the functioning of the service. From my perspective, that is an absolute perfect application of user-centered IT, because at the very, very bottom of the technical architecture, people are thinking about the customer and what their experience is. It means building in support for monitoring and measurement from an application design and development perspective. It means that QA has to validate all of it. It's not just about functional testing. It's not just about regression testing. It's about validating the entire service. So if you have this continuous delivery process, if you have A/B testing that allows you to deliver functionality every 4 hours and release it to half of your audience or 10% of your audience or whatever the case may be, well, that's something that has to be validated because it's part of the functioning of what you're doing. On the one hand, I hope I'm not being too repetitive. On the other hand, that's my whole point, is to be really repetitive here. Because I really only have one thing to say. Classic case operations. They have all these great monitoring tools, and they know that the servers are up, and they know that the network is up, and they know that the database is up, but they don't know that they're running a blogging platform and commenting is broken. And the customer calls up and says commenting is broken. Well, why is the customer telling you that commenting is broken? Why isn't the operations group telling you that? Isn't that part of their job? So at a very remedial level, operations people need to be thinking about keeping the application, keeping the service alive, not just keeping the infrastructure alive. And as you get more into the cloud world, the excuses for that start to go away. I think we're about to run out of time, so I'm going to speed through this. And in fact, I'm just going to go straight ahead to the conclusion. I'm going to quickly talk about support. Support is almost always forgotten, both customer-facing support and back-office support. If they don't get the tools that they need, if they don't get treated as customers, because they are customers of the application, if they don't get treated as part of the service, well, then you have these similar breakdowns. You have this similar increase in friction. You have degradation of customer satisfaction. So, in conclusion, the driving force here is that the difference between public and private IT is dissolving. Users expect everything, everywhere, all the time. So we all need to design for that. We're all in the service business, and we all have to think about functionality, operability, and service experience. None of this is going to happen overnight. What I'm doing here today is not really giving any answers, but simply pointing out the challenges. Continuous improvement is really the key. One of the things I don't like sometimes about the Agile movement is it has a tendency to say Agile is good and waterfall is bad. And even if we posit that that's true, well, how do you get from point A to point B? So there's a lot of work to be done to get from point A to point B. But the key is to shift the discussion. So instead of saying, oh, shit, here comes the cloud, what are we going to do? The question is, how are we going to be more lean? And one thing I want to say is all this stuff with cloud computing is just about lean computing. It's just a solution for helping IT organizations and infrastructure groups be more lean and more agile and more responsive. Going from how do we keep chaos at bay, because what we're talking about is chaos. We're talking about losing control over our users, to how do we manage it through resiliency. Everyone needs to be thinking about the entire customer journey, whether you're an ops guy or a marketing guy or a QA person. And really, it's about lean innovation across the entire service organization. So, thanks, everyone.